We're here today in Rockwell College to make a documentary on Irish stained glass. The glass of An Turglina, Harry Clarke and the Harry Clarke Studio, with particular reference to the glass in Rockwell College. Now, although I've been an historian for about 50 years and I've always been interested in stained glass, I wasn't involved in its history until about 30 years ago when I was working for the Church of Ireland and I was asked to go to Cork to get involved in a survey being done by an English expert, Dr. David Lawrence. As a result, I organised a similar survey in the Diocese of Meath and Kildare the following year, and then it passed on to this Diocese of Cashel Arts. The reason for this was that the Church of Ireland had become aware that most parishes don't know much about their stained glass and that they need advice on its conservation. After that, I was asked to write a book on St. Patrick and stained glass, and that led to various other commissions. This was more a labour of love than anything else, and it was wonderful to have really good colour illustrations. The art of making stained glass windows began well over 1300 years ago. While the Romans developed window glass, it's believed that translucent coloured glass is of Byzantine origin. By the 12th century, the art was well established in Europe, using complex techniques which have changed very little until today. There is a considerable body of 12th century glass, particularly in France and England, in places such as Chartres Cathedral, Canterbury Cathedral, York Minster. But given our checkered history in Ireland, you won't be surprised to find that we have no 12th century glass. This illustration of Adam seems to appear in every book on English medieval glass. This is Adam in Canterbury Cathedral. A 12th century monk called Theophilus Presbyter described how coloured glass, known as pot metal, was made by adding various metallic oxides to the pots in which the glass was melted. So blue came from cobalt, green from copper, red from iron, and so on. The molten glass was then blown and shaped into sheets. As we see in this illustration here, you can see the bubble of pot metal at the end of the iron rod, and it was then spun until the bubble spread out into a large disc. The process left a scar in the middle, and that is called the bull's eye. And so you might find references to bullseye glass. The design for a window began with a small coloured drawing, the sketch, after which the cartoon was drawn full scale on a sheet of paper or an off-white wooden table. And the sheets of glass were cut to fit into the pattern. Then faces, clothing, and details such as Christian symbols were painted onto the glass. The only pigment used was a black or dark green, dark brown vitreous enamel. All other colours came from the glass itself. The one exception being what's called silver staining, in which silver nitrate is applied to the outside surface of the glass, which then turned yellow or gold, depending on the extent of the firing in the furnace. This technique is of great use for halos and crowns, as we'll see as we progress. After painting, the glass had to be baked in a kiln to fix the paint onto the surface. It was then relaid on the table to fit the design. This 16th century woodcut shows the artist painting a small panel for which the design hangs on his left, along with cartoons for heraldic panels. Another woodcut shows a glazier's workshop where a panel of bullseye glass is being leaded up. Various tools can be seen, including gros irons, which are pliers for clipping the edges of the glass. Lead plays an important Parton windows, and it gives a strong black outline to the design. And it is surprising that lead lines are just accepted by the eye, so they don't generally intrude on the view of a window. I have here a small section of glass made for us. It comes from one of the Evie Hone windows. Let's have a look at the process. You see the artist choosing between two different pieces of glass. So you can see her cutting along a line and then carefully breaking it apart. If you've cut cleanly, when you have a little tap on the table, the pieces come apart quite easily. If not, you have to use your browsing irons to tidy it up, because otherwise they won't fit together. So now, having got them in line, she's preparing to add the lead. This is very traditional. You can see the lead calms. This is very much as it would have been done in the 12th century. Stained glass is a very slow and detailed business altogether. There are so many processes. Putting them on with a little light hammer to get them to fit neatly round this side of the glass. You have to solder to hold the leads together. Now clearly, of course, we've done this just to illustrate some of the processes, because if these were going in the window, the whole window would be leaded up together. By the 16th century, the medieval skills of making stained glass had been lost, and artists in the Low Countries, that is modern Belgium and the Netherlands, were producing windows by painting pictures in enamel on white glass. Many of these are to be found, for instance, in the Oxbridge College chapels. Interesting as they might have been, they lost all the traditional translucence which makes stained glass so compelling. But it wasn't until the 19th century that the medieval art was recovered, largely as a result of experiments in the workshops of James Powell of Whitefriars, London. Powell's was one of the first firms to install figurative windows using medieval skills, and one of the few which made their own glass. Its fame was established by brilliant designers such as Edward Burne-Jones, whose first stained glass window is actually in Ireland in St. Patrick's Cathedral trim. Likewise, the reputation of Hardman of Birmingham was based on the designs of Augustus Pugin. Some of Pugin's early work can be seen in Ireland, notably at St. Aidan's Cathedral, Enniscorthy. By the 1860s, many firms were working in stained glass, firms such as Clayton & Bell and Lavers & Barrow of London. Their early work was often at a very high standard, but inevitably, as commissions poured in from cathedrals and churches, there was a tendency to use designs again and again. While a window of the 1860s can often be attributed to a particular artist, by the 1890s, a large firm had a hand specialist, a head specialist, and so on, and a window cartooned by one artist might be painted by 3 or 4. This inevitably diluted the artistic authenticity. There were competent Irish firms in the 19th century, including Early and Powell of Dublin, but the really exciting development was the establishment in 1903 by Sarah Purser of the stained glass studio known as An Túr Glynne, the Tower of Glass. Essential to the studio was the training provided by Alfred Child in the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. Very much part of the Irish cultural revival which saw the foundation of the Gaelic League and the Abbey Theatre, it was based on the arts and crafts movement in England, and it attracted a new generation of gifted artists, including Michael Healy, Beatrice Elvery, Wilhelmina Geddes, and later Evie Hone. The most famous of all Irish stained glass artists, Harry Clarke, wasn't a member of the studio, but trained in the Dublin School of Art under Child, worked in his father's firm, and it ultimately became Harry Clarke Stained Glass. The next illustration is really appropriate for a documentary for the Cashel Arts Festival, as it is a depiction of King Cormac of Cashel in a window in St. Patrick's Cathedral, cartooned by Sarah Purser and painted by Child. Purser was primarily a portraitist, and her painterly style is clear in the faces. The rich gold purples of the figures are set against pale quarries. So quarries, which can be seen above here, are diamond, square or rectangular pieces of glass, generally used to frame a figure or scene. Quarries were introduced by Child and are often seen in the early work of the studio. As we're in Rockwell College, I'm going to concentrate on the stained glass of Evie Hone and Harry Clarke, whose studio is represented here. Evie Hone was an outstanding religious painter and a stained glass artist of international repute. Born in 1894, she had polio as a child, which left her with many physical handicaps, but she still managed to take art classes, first in London, then in Paris, where she was joined by her friend Maini Gellett. At first they worked with the semi-cubist painter André Lout, and then with the abstract cubist painter and theorist Albert Glaise, who encouraged them to study early Christian art. We're going to use some sketches done for us by Petronelle Clifton Brown to illustrate some of the influences visible in Hone's early work. Here we have the Rock of Cashel in cubist form. Very simple, concentrating on the essence of the picture. And this is Petronelle's rendering of the crucifixion, exactly the kind of portrayal that Evie Hone would have done. Hone's early work was heavily influenced by Cubism, especially in her figures, an inheritance from the craftsmen of Chartres Cathedral, but also echoes from early Irish stone carving and from Byzantine art. So what you see is simple, heavily leaded lines, faces quite distinctive, but again very simply painted. And the whole is very effective. It's a very good illustration of what I said, that lead lines are a very important part. But just seeing this black and white representation, I think, makes very clear her medieval inheritance. Hone was a deeply spiritual person who sought to express her faith in her art, and she gradually moved towards figurative representation and therefore to stained glass. She may have been led to that medium by the influence of another religious artist, Georges Rouault, who emphasized colour over realistic representation. By the time she began working in stained glass, she was already 38 and was an accomplished artist in oils and gouache. Sarah Purser, however, rejected her first application to Anturglina in 1932. So she went to work in London as a pupil of Wilhelmina Geddes, who taught her many of her stained glass skills. With Geddes' guidance, she converted two abstract gouache into her earliest stained glass piece, an Annunciation window made in 1933 and subsequently placed in St Nahi's Church of Ireland, Dundrum, County Dublin. Highly coloured and using a wide palette of reds, blues, yellows and greens, the central panel is a simple depiction of the Annunciation, while the outer panels in similar hues are abstract. They're made up of quarries of different sizes, shapes and colours, some hatched, some stippled, others with distinct patterns. Hone's first commission came from Major and Mrs. Kirkwood for the Church of Ireland Church in Ardcarn, County Roscommon. Mrs. Kirkwood, born Grace Harriet Jemison, was a landscape and still life artist, a close friend of Hone and Jellett, who had also studied under Lute in Paris. And it was clearly she who chose Hone to execute this window in their parish church near the Kirkwoods' home. The window depicts Patrick, Bridget and Berak, but we will look only at two sections, both of them featuring Patrick. His right hand is raised in blessing and he's wearing episcopal purple with a red mitre surrounded by a red halo filled with brightest gold. There you have the silver staining again. You can see suggestions in the background of Irish mountains and lakes. And if this is really local, the lake, of course, is Lough Key nearby. This is an illustration from my book on St. Patrick in stained glass. It shows the Eucharist, and given the bareness of the setting, one might suggest it took place in the open air, reflecting Hone's understanding that Patrick travelled in a country where there were few churches, that he would have carried with him a chalice and paten, and would have improvised an altar. The huge chalice signifies the importance of the sacrament both to Patrick and to Hone. Notice the vivid colours and the strong lines in every aspect of the glass. Not only does Hone use thick black lead lines to delineate the figures and the chalice, but she also paints the drapes with thick, dark strokes. That first commission encouraged her to apply again to Sarah Purser, who admitted her to Intourglina in 1935. Although she remained a member until the studio closed in 1944, she didn't fit into the arts and crafts tradition, her love of the abstract marking her out from the other artists. She had spent some time with an Anglican community of nuns in Devon, but was received into membership of the Roman Catholic Church at Blackrock College in 1938 by John Charles McQuaid, President of the college in the 1930s and Archbishop of Dublin from 1940. This connection proved important for Hone's future career as a stained glass artist, as McQuaid was the most influential of a group of Spiritans who had an interest in the arts. Father Jeremiah Vincent Dinan, born in Borrisokane, educated at Blackrock College, joined the staff there in 1930. He was appointed president of Rockwell College in 1939, where he oversaw the building of the tower and two new wings. Part of his legacy was the installation of the windows by Evie Hone and Harry Clarke Studio between 1941 and 1944. Most of Hone's windows in Blackrock College were decorative, with armorial or episcopal shields, and her windows here in Rockwell College are similar. Above the entrance is a small three-light window showing the crest and motto of the Spiritans, the heavenly dove descending, set in a shield, beneath which is the motto, Cor unum et anima una, one heart and one soul. One side window shows the Rockwell College crest and motto, Inter mutanda constantia, constancy in the midst of change. And the other side window shows the arms of Archbishop McQuaid and his motto, Testimonium perhibere veritati, to bear witness to the truth. It incorporates the gold papal cross and the green archiepiscopal galero. All are framed by elaborate multicoloured quarries in shades of red, blue, green, yellow, brown and purple, very typical of Hone's work. As a result of Archbishop McQuaid's patronage, Hone received many other commissions for educational establishments, including several windows for Clongoweswood College, Kildare. From 1944, she worked in her own studio at Marley Grange in Rathfarnham. There she made her finest series of windows. It was as a result of these windows that she received her most famous commission, a huge 9-light window in Eton College Chapel in England. This is one of her more conventional windows, very clearly showing the Virgin and Child with the other gospel participants, Joseph, one of the shepherds, the 3 wise men following a star which is placed above their heads. All of this against the background of the stable and its 4-legged occupants. Her colour palette is among the simplest, bright reds and blues, with flashes of gold and shades of purple and mauve. You will notice that the black lead lines are much less strong in this window, and the paintwork is lighter. Notice that the faces of the Virgin and the infant Saviour are white, whereas 2 of the wise men have blue faces. It's very simple and very effective. The patronage of Archbishop McQuaid also led to the Harry Clarke Studio windows in Rockwell in the early 1940s. After Clarke's death in 1931, the studio continued to work, but inevitably lost his vibrancy and brilliance. However, the 2 major windows make a considerable impact. In a very large window on the landing in the entrance hall, Our Lady of Rockwell has been described as shedding her graces over all college activities. So we get vignettes of the Mass, science, Latin, rugby, hurling, rowing, drama, and music. At the centre is a vibrant blue Virgin with a flaming red halo. The sections need no interpretation as they are very clearly delineated. So you see 3 rugby players and an actor as a colourful soldier, presumably in a Shakespeare play. Just in case the viewer misses the point, there's a bright red mask at bottom right. Another large window, Our Lady of the Woods, stands at the top of another flight of stairs, depicting the Virgin and Child in bright blue and pink against a dappled pale blue background dotted with stars. The setting is a wood of fruit trees, and there are 3 red doves flying around with 2 young deer at the base. The face of the Virgin is beautifully painted. Both these windows were designed to have an uplifting effect on the students of Rockwell College. But when we look at some of Harry Clarke's own glass, we see the extent to which the studio retained its competence but lost his brilliance. This miniature panel of Saint-Julien is made of 3 pieces of glass. The clear panel, showing at left a goat, diffuses light through the flashed blue and ruby glass, which would otherwise be very dark. The tall figure of the saint dominates, with stern, angular features in profile against a black, golden scalloped halo, which isn't all that easy to see. Julian is one of Clarke's archetypal ascetic figures, deathly pale, with heavy eyelids, long, tapering fingers, and elaborately stylized clothing. You can see rich Romanesque arches at top left, and several of his stylized flowers, a very prominent yellow one towards the base. Next, we look at a detail in one of the wonderful set of windows depicting Irish saints, which Harry Clarke did for the Hone Chapel in University College, Cork. The window depicts Gobnut, the patron saint of beekeeping, and this detail is the tiny figure of a robber on whom she released her bees to prevent the theft of her beehive. His eyes are wide with terror. His hair in tight curls stylized as in Celtic ornament, while his coat is intricately decorated. Hubert, the patron saint of huntsmen, is another of Clarke's archetypal figures. He is shown in his lustrous hunting gear with his quiver of arrows visible on the left. His pale face is framed by dark hair. Silver earrings hang beneath his crimson fur-trimmed hat, which sports a white ostrich feather. You may be able to see the moth against the acid pink of his plain halo. He wears a green silk scarf with tassels, atop a richly patterned tunic, and intricately decorated metal belt. Again, we see tiny floral motifs painted on a multicolored background. This small panel depicts the conversion of St. Hubert when he was out hunting. On encountering a stag with a cross between its antlers, he dismounted his horse and knelt in devotion. The scene is exquisitely painted, acided, and stained on a single piece of flash blue glass. Clarke's use of this blue is highly distinctive. You can see the dark stems of the trees and the moonlight streaming across the ground, his horse standing patiently behind him, his dog lying in front of him, and it's all quite a magical atmosphere. Clarke was truly an artistic genius, but I believe that he wasn't primarily a religious artist, as is evidenced by his choice of legend and myth in his 11 windows in the Hone Chapel, and also in the many illustrations which he did for Shakespeare plays. To my mind, there's no doubt that the best religious artist was Wilhelmina Geddes. This is Geddes's Patrick in St. Sedma's Church in Larne. She incorporates the legend of St. Patrick, but her representation of the saint shows deep reflection on his character as revealed in his writings. This is probably the best stained glass depiction of the historical Patrick. Look at the strong head, the furrowed brow, the piercing eyes of the aging saint, the sinewy arm with which he grasps his staff, his stern demeanour. It reminds me greatly of depictions of St. Peter, the rock on which the church was built. And it captures accurately the character of the saint as is shown in his writings. In the predella, or base panel, Patrick is in his prime, robed in episcopal attire, royal blue cope, sapphire alb, white robe, mitre and scarf. Thick lead lines outline his figure and the glowing paschal fire he lit on the hill of Slane. Its glow is intersected by the raised hand of King Leary's emissary, asking how he dared outshine the beacon lit on Tower Hill for the great annual pagan gathering. Behind Patrick, two of his followers clasp their hands nervously. The crudely drawn legs of the envoys show how primitive their ways are, while Patrick's indomitable figure indicates how the story will end. His huge feet remind us that he is going to proclaim the gospel of peace. There are so many interesting stained glass windows that we could be here for a very long time, but I would encourage you to go and look at stained glass for yourself. Some churches and cathedrals have guides. There are some books that you can get to give you guidance on it, but nothing really replaces going and looking for yourself, sometimes with binoculars.